3 years ago, he believed he lost his twin daughters forever. But then, on a dusty bus winding through a forgotten road, he heard their voices singing. What he found wasn't just a miracle that shattered his heart, it broke his entire world before the story even began. Wherever you're watching this video from, drop a comment below and let us know. And if stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Now, settle in and get ready. This is a story you won't forget. Some mornings start like they're already over before the sun's even up. You wake up with a weight pressing deep inside your chest, cold like winter wind slicing through worn clothes. It's a heaviness that no blanket can smother, no coffee can chase away. That morning, I woke up in that exact way, hollow, tired before the day began, feeling the world turn its back on me. The small town didn't care, the wind didn't care, and I sure as hell didn't care either. I was just another ghost waiting to be forgotten. My name doesn't matter here. Nobody ever asked, and nobody ever cared. To the few who glanced my way, I was just another man broken by years of mistakes and fights he never won. A man who'd lost too much, lived too little, and now carried the weight of every lost moment like a stone in his pocket. That morning, like many others, I was heading into town to get the tools sharpened. Simple enough. A quiet day, no trouble. But as I rode past the cracked fence and the dusty street corner, I saw her. She was tied to a fence post just behind the saloon, a tiny thing no bigger than a scarecrow left to rust in the sun. Barefoot, mud caked on her ankles like she'd been dragged through every low place in this forsaken town. Her arms stretched above her head, wrists red and blistered where the rope bit deep, her ragged dress clinging to her like wet paper. I noticed her sunken cheeks first, then the way she barely made a sound quieter than the dust whispering through the empty streets. No one knew her name. No one asked for it. She was just a thing to be wagered, traded, forgotten. The crowd around her wasn't much better gamblers, drunks, men too lost in their own desperation to even glance her way. They laughed, spat, flipped cards, and tossed coins, but none of them seemed interested in the child. She was just background noise, part of the scenery in a town that had long lost its soul. But I saw her. I'd seen a lot in my 40 years. Lost a wife, a home, dreams I never dared to dream in the first place. The ranch I barely held together was falling apart piece by piece, and every morning I broke myself trying to keep it alive. I wasn't a hero or a savior. I was just a man passing by who couldn't stand to see a child like that left to rot. I stayed a moment, watching as the wind picked up dust, and the gambler leaned in, chewing on some jerky eyes hard as broken glass. "Gambler's kid," he muttered. "Owes every man in town. Using her to pay off what he can't cover." Didn't sound surprised. Nobody did. I didn't say a word. Didn't need to. I slid off my horse, the weight of my boots silent on the dirt, and walked to her side. The rope was rough and cruel, but my hands had done rougher things. I knelt down and cut the cords with a blade tucked in my coat. She didn't stumble away, just leaned into me, a faint, fragile thing clinging to anything solid. That day, I brought her home. The ranch wasn't much broken fences, a leaky barn, the cold biting through every crack. But it was safe, or at least safer than that market square. She didn't say much, didn't ask questions, just followed me like a shadow, eyes wide and watchful, like she was waiting for the next storm. For days, she sat quiet, staring at the fire, trying to remember how to trust warmth and kindness. She didn't know what a hot meal was, or how to hold a spoon without trembling. I watched her, and I thought maybe I was broken too, not by debt or loss, but by a lifetime of running from ghosts that never let me rest. The world didn't care about her, and for a long time I didn't either. But something about her quiet strength, the way she kept breathing, kept holding on, pulled at a part of me I thought was dead. We settled into a rhythm. Cold mornings splitting wood, cold nights sharing silence. She learned to hold the rifle, not to shoot, but to feel its weight, a reminder that maybe she wasn't helpless after all. I rebuilt the fence with her, each nail driven like a promise. But the past has a way of catching up. The law came knocking. Men with badges and bitterness, calling her property, demanding papers I didn't have. The child who once whispered, "Don't lock me in the barn," stood tall now, harder than the stones around us. She wasn't afraid anymore. Neither was I. Her mother came then, ragged, haunted, but alive. 3 souls bound by broken promises, heading toward a fragile hope in an old shack beyond the ridges. Fire followed us, as it always does. But fire can't burn what's already forged in flame. When the ashes settled, the neighbors stood with us. Not because they had to, but because sometimes even the loneliest men can find family. And in the end, it wasn't about rescue. It was about rising from the ash, about what you do when the world tries to break you, and you stand back up anyway. Because sometimes the person you save is the one who saves you back. I learned early on that silence can be the loudest sound in the world. After that first day when I cut her loose from the rope and took her away from that filthy post, she didn't say much. Not because she was shy, but because she was broken, in ways no words could reach. It was like she had been taught to disappear, to hold her breath and fold herself into the shadows so tight that no one could find her. The ranch was a miserable place, the kind of place that had forgotten how to hope. The barn roof sagged, the fence had more holes than boards, and the cold had a way of creeping in through the cracks like it belonged there. I never expected much from it, but it was mine. And that day, it became hers too. She followed me inside, her steps light but uneven, like she was carrying the weight of all the past on her small shoulders. Her eyes didn't meet mine. They never did, not at first. But they told a story, quiet, afraid, searching. I fed her what little I had, some beans, stale bread, and water from the creek. She didn't eat right away, just stared at the food as if it were something foreign, something she wasn't sure she deserved. When she finally took a bite, her face twisted not from hunger, but confusion. I realized then she didn't know what it meant to eat without fear, to be allowed to fill the belly without paying a price later. I watched her for hours after that, just sitting in the dim light, trying to figure out how to reach the girl who'd been tied up like cattle and left for the vultures. I remembered my wife, how she used to fill the house with kindness, how she made even broken things feel like they belonged. But that morning, I had no wife, no magic words, just an empty room and a scared child who didn't know how to be anything but small. I found a blanket folded on the cot by the fireplace and pointed to it. "This is yours," I said softly. She didn't move, just nodded, as if the word itself was too heavy to carry. That night, I slept in the chair by the fire, half listening to the wind outside and half thinking about how a life could fall apart piece by piece, leaving nothing but dust and silence. She woke early, not because I told her to, not because there was a bell or a shout, just because she had learned long ago that morning was another chance to survive. She lay still on the cot, eyes open, breath shallow, like she was trying to decide if the warmth was real or just a trick the world played on broken people. I was outside, splitting wood with an old axe that had seen better days. The sound echoed through the canyon, steady and certain, like a heartbeat. She came to the porch, bare feet sinking into frostbitten grass. She didn't speak. She didn't ask. She just stood there, watching, waiting. I nodded toward the chicken coop. "Feed the hens," I said. She moved like a ghost, slow and careful. Her hands were red from the cold, fingers stiff. When she came back, she sat on the porch steps, knees pulled close to her chest, eyes fixed on the empty road. I wondered what she was waiting for, what ghost she was chasing in the dust. Days passed and still she said little. She cleaned the floor 3 times a day, scrubbed the stove until the black iron gleamed, folded her blanket perfectly each night. I told her she didn't have to, but every time I spoke, her eyes darted wide, like she was bracing for a blow that never came. She didn't know how to live with kindness, didn't know what to do when no one was screaming. It was easier for me. I was used to being alone, used to living with the silence that comes after a life falls apart. But watching her, I saw how fragile that silence could be. how much it weighed on a child who had only known chains and fear. I tried to teach her the things that mattered: how to hold a rifle, not to shoot, but to feel the weight of something solid in her hands. To know she wasn't helpless. How to tend the fire, how to patch a fence, how to stand steady when the wind tried to push you down. She listened. She learned. But there was still something locked deep inside her eyes, something the cold couldn't reach. One night, just before dawn, I heard a creak. She was standing in the doorway, eyes glassy, whispering, "Don't lock me in the barn." I lowered my rifle and nodded. "I won't." She had been locked away before. She knew what it meant to be trapped, to be forgotten. And I knew then, no matter how broken we both were, I couldn't let her become a prisoner again. The days grew longer, and she began humming. Just barely, quietly, when she thought I wasn't near. It was off-key, shaky, like a bird learning how to sing after a storm. I didn't say anything, I just listened. She didn't ask about my past, didn't ask about the wife I lost or the debts I carried. She didn't ask for much. Just space to breathe and a place to call safe, even if it was a broken-down ranch on the edge of nowhere. But the past has a way of catching up. Word started to spread in town. "Who's the girl?" they whispered. "Where'd she come from?" I didn't answer. Didn't want to. The neighbors were curious, but mostly kept their distance. Some looked at me with suspicion, others with something close to respect, but none dared cross the line. Then came the men, 3 of them, riding slow, eyes hard and cold. The preacher, the deputy, and the man with the gambler's smirk. They came with words and papers, talking about property and law, about debts settled and ownership. They said the girl was not mine to keep, that she was a thing to be returned. I didn't argue, not with words. I just stood between them and her, silent and steady. She didn't flinch. That night, the 3 men rode away with empty hands but heavy eyes. The next morning, the woman came. She was no older than 30, but the lines on her face told stories of a life twice as long and twice as hard. She walked slowly, leaning on a cane carved from old wood, and when she saw the girl, her knees gave out. "Mama," the girl whispered, voice barely a breath. The reunion was raw and quiet. The woman, her mother, was ragged, bruised, and haunted by ghosts no one else could see. She told a story of lies and broken promises, of being told her daughter was gone forever. But she came back, just like she said she would. We were 3 now, bound by pain and hope, heading toward an old shack near the edge of the world, a place to start again. The fire came like a reckoning. It spread fast, tearing through dry brush and old wood, swallowing everything in its angry blaze. I ran to save what I could: old linens, dried herbs, a child's drawing pinned to a wall. The drawing was a woman, a girl, and a red house, the only thing left unburned. We escaped just in time. The fire left scars on the land, but it couldn't burn what we had started to build inside us. When we returned, the house was gone. The fence torn down. The rocking chair my wife had carved lay in splinters. But the neighbors were there, not with questions, not with pity, just with tools, water, blankets. They didn't ask about the past. They just helped us rebuild. I looked at the girl, no longer just a frightened child, but a girl who had found a voice. She spoke now, not with fear, but with quiet strength. When Caleb Dawes came back, the man who once called her property, the gambler's son, with a sour grin, she slapped him hard across the face. I stood beside her, steady and unyielding. This was our home now. We weren't running anymore. We were here to stay. The night after the fire was the coldest I'd ever known. We huddled close around a small campfire just beyond the ashes of what had once been our home. The stars overhead were sharp and distant, like tiny pinpricks in the vast black sky. The wind whispered through the burnt trees, carrying with it the smell of smoke and loss. The girl, her name was now Emma, sat close to her mother, who still trembled, half from the chill and half from the weight of memories she had no choice but to carry. I sat a little apart from them, watching the flicker of the flames dance in their eyes. The fire had taken our shelter, but it couldn't touch the fragile hope beginning to bloom in that cold, dark night. I thought about what it meant to build something from nothing, to take the broken pieces of a life and shape them into something new, something whole. But before we could do that, we had to face the ghosts that followed us like shadows. The morning came gray and heavy. The three of us packed what little remained into a battered wagon I'd borrowed from old Joe down the road. The horses were thin but steady, and the wheels groaned against the rocky path as we made our slow way toward the outskirts of town. Emma's mother, whose name was Ruth, sat silently, staring out at the landscape like she was seeing it for the first time. Every mile seemed to peel back layers of pain she had buried deep inside her. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but noticed the flickers of strength returning to Ruth, the way she straightened in the seat, how her hands gripped the reins with purpose instead of fear. Emma sat beside me, clutching a small bundle of worn clothes and a faded photograph of a man we never spoke about. Her fingers traced the edges carefully, like it was the last piece of a puzzle she desperately wanted to solve. We stopped in town for supplies, food, nails, blankets, anything we could trade for cash or favors. The streets were busy, people going about their lives, faces lined with worry and exhaustion, but not unkindness. It was clear they'd heard about us. Whispers followed us in the market square, eyes flicking our way. But no one stopped us or asked questions. That silence was a strange kind of acceptance. At the general store, I bartered for a small stove and some cooking pots. Ruth held Emma's hand tightly, whispering promises I couldn't hear but hoped were true. Outside, a rough-voiced man approached me. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but his eyes were sharp. "You're the one who took that girl off the post," he said, voice low and gravelly. I didn't flinch. "I saved her," he sneered. "The Dawes family don't forget easy. They don't forgive neither." I clenched my fists, but said nothing. "You're stirring up trouble," he warned, then walked away. That evening, we found a small cabin for rent at the edge of town, owned by a widow named Mrs. Callahan. Her husband had died last winter, and she was more than willing to have company, even if they came with shadows. The cabin was rough but safe. Wood creaked beneath our feet, and the hearth was cold, but it was ours, if only for a little while. Ruth started to cook, the scent of stew filling the tiny kitchen. Emma helped, peeling potatoes with careful, deliberate movements. It was the first meal we shared that didn't feel like survival. Days passed, and the routine settled like dust. Emma went to the schoolhouse, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. Ruth started sewing for neighbors, repairing clothes and mending curtains. I worked odd jobs around town, fixing fences, hauling wood, anything to bring in a few coins. The past, however, was never far behind. One afternoon, while repairing a broken fence on the outskirts, I spotted a familiar figure watching from the shadows. It was Caleb Dawes. He didn't approach, but held my gaze for a long moment before turning and disappearing into the brush. I knew it was a warning. That night, Ruth told me stories of her childhood of laughter and light, before the darkness took hold. Her voice was soft but fierce, like a candle burning against the storm. Emma listened, wide-eyed, soaking in the warmth and hope. For the first time, I saw something change in her, the walls around her heart starting to crack. But danger was closer than we thought. One morning, a group of men rode into town, armed, hardened faces and eyes filled with cold intent. The Dawes family had sent them. They demanded Emma be returned, or there would be consequences. The town sheriff tried to intervene, but the Dawes men didn't care for law or order. I stood before them, alone and unarmed, and told them no. They laughed. Ruth stepped forward, holding Emma close, her voice steady and clear. "We are not property," she said. "We are people, and we will not be taken." The standoff was tense, a silent battle of wills. But the townsfolk, seeing our courage, started to gather. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now stood with us, lending voices and strength. The Dawes men backed down for now. That night, as the town quieted, I looked at Emma and Ruth and knew this fight was far from over. But for the first time, I believed we could win. The days following the standoff felt like walking on the edge of a razor. Each morning brought a brittle calm, but beneath it, a tension that tightened like a noose around my chest. The Dawes family hadn't given up. They were patient, and in their patience lay danger. I watched Emma closely. The light in her eyes, once flickering like a candle struggling against the wind, had begun to steady. Yet sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, I caught the shadow of fear cross her face, a ghost of memories she refused to share. Ruth was different. She wore a quiet armor now, forged by grief and determination. Her hands moved with purpose, cooking, cleaning, sewing, but her eyes told a story I knew well. One of loss, regret, and the desperate hope for a future. Town was changing around us, too. The neighbors who once looked away now spoke softly in our favor. Mrs. Callahan brought extra food and mended Emma's worn clothes without asking for payment. Old Joe offered to fix the wagon and warned me about the Dawes' reach, spreading beyond the county line. There was comfort in these small acts of kindness. They reminded me that even in broken places, hope could take root. One evening, after a long day hauling lumber, I found Ruth and Emma sitting by the fire pit outside the cabin. The flames flickered against the dark, casting long shadows. Ruth was telling Emma stories of her own Madeira woman, fierce and loving, who had taught her to stand strong even when the world tried to break her. Emma listened, the corner of her mouth lifting in a shy smile. It was the first real smile I'd seen from her since that night she came to me tied to a post. I realized then that healing wasn't just about safety or food. It was about reclaiming the stories lost in silence. But the past was patient. 2 nights later, a shadow moved at the edge of the woods near our cabin. I spotted it just as the moon slipped behind a cloud. My hand went instinctively to the rifle I'd managed to keep hidden under the bed. The figure didn't come closer, but the message was clear. We were being watched. I told Ruth and Emma, but I could see the same worry mirrored in their eyes. The next day, I sought out the sheriff. He was a man worn by years of law and compromise, but there was a flicker of respect in his eyes when I told him about the threats. "We'll do what we can," he said. But I could tell he knew the Dawes family's shadow stretched farther than he dared admit. Still, it was the best we had. Emma began to grow more comfortable with the town. She went to school regularly, her laughter occasionally breaking the silence of the classroom. The other children were curious but gentle. One afternoon, she brought home a wildflower bouquet, hands trembling as she presented it to Ruth. She picked them by the creek. Ruth told me, voice soft but proud. Small moments like these became lifelines. But one morning, our fragile peace shattered. A fire was set not far from the cabin. Flames licked the dry grass, hungry and fast. We scrambled to douse the blaze, but it was no accident. The Dawes family was sending a message, one we couldn't ignore. That night, we sat in the cabin, windows shuttered tight, listening to the crackling distant fire and the howl of the wind. I knew then that running was no longer an option. If we wanted to survive, we had to fight. But how does a man who'd spent years hiding from his own demons find the strength to face the world's? Days blurred into weeks. Ruth, Emma, and I forged a rhythm not one of peace, but of resistance. We fortified the cabin, built stronger fences, and kept watch through the long nights. Neighbors helped where they could. Mrs. Callahan brought extra blankets and food. Old Joe lent tools and a watchful eye. Together, we became a small but unyielding force. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the sky, Ruth took my hand. "Do you think we'll ever be free of this?" she asked quietly. I looked into her eyes and saw the weight she carried. "Maybe not," I said. "But freedom isn't just a place. It's a fight, and we're not done yet." Emma, sitting nearby, looked up and nodded. She was no longer the scared girl tied to a post. She was a survivor. The final days of the month came with news. The Dawes family was mobilizing, sending more men, planning a showdown that could end everything. But we weren't afraid anymore. We had each other. The night before the expected attack, I sat outside the cabin, the rifle across my lap. Emma came out, wrapped in a blanket. She sat beside me, her small hand finding mine. "We're going to be okay," I told her. She squeezed my hand tight, because we're together. The dawn broke with a chorus of crows. "Man rodet overt usgrim faces," weapons ready. But we stood our ground. The battle was fierce but brief. Neighbors joined us, their presence tipping the scales. When the dust settled, the Dawes men retreated, their threat broken for now. In the aftermath, as the sun warmed the scorched earth, I looked at Emma and Ruth. We had been broken, burned, hunted, but we were still here, still standing. And for the first time in a long time, I believed in a future beyond fear. We woke to a cold wind whispering through the broken windows of the cabin. The kind of wind that carries warnings. The ground outside was still scorched, blackened earth where the fire had swept like a hungry ghost. The smell of smoke lingered heavy in the air, a reminder of how close we'd come to losing everything again. Ruth was already up, tending the small garden patch that stubbornly clung to life among the ashes. Her hands worked the soil with care, as if coaxing life back from death was something simple. But we all knew it wasn't. Not yet. Emma sat by the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the grain of the worn wood, eyes distant but calm. She was learning to live with the shadows of her past, but they were still there sometimes, lurking in the corners of her mind. I poured coffee, the steam warming my fingers. This house was no mansion, no fortress. It was fragile like us, but it was ours. We had fought tooth and nail to get here, and no matter how many times the flames tried to claim us, we refused to burn away completely. "Today," I told them quietly, "we begin again." The morning light stretched over the ridge as we loaded the wagon. The same wagon that had carried us from that first broken shack to this fragile new home. Ruth packed supplies, her movements steady and sure. Emma, with her small hands, helped wrap blankets and tie bundles. I felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper on my shoulders than ever before. This was more than just survival now. It was about rebuilding a life, a real life on the ruins left behind. We traveled slow, the wagon creaking under the weight of our hopes and memories. The road ahead was long, winding through scrubland dotted with scrub oak and wildflowers struggling against the dust. It felt like the land itself was watching us, holding its breath. Ruth kept close to Emma, whispering encouragement, telling stories of better days. Emma listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes quiet. I stayed close behind, keeping watch, my eyes tracing every movement along the tree line. Night fell before we reached the edge of the valley where the old ranch lay. It was a place caught between time-weathered fences, broken tools rusting in the dirt, and the skeleton of the barn looming like a monument to better days. The house was still standing, but the roof sagged and the windows were boarded up. The front gate hung crooked, swaying in the cold breeze. We set up camp near the remains of the orchard, the trees bare but stubborn, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like fingers begging for mercy. It was a hard place, but it was ours now. That night, as the fire crackled, I told Ruth and Emma about the man who had once built this land, a man who fought hard to make something of nothing, who had lost more than most ever understood. "You carry his strength," I said softly, "and his scars." The days that followed were filled with sweat and toil. We cleared the debris, patched the roof, and fixed the fences as best we could. Emma took to helping in the garden, her fingers learning to coax life from stubborn soil just as Ruth did. I rebuilt the tool shed, my hands aching from the work, but my heart lighter for it. But even in this fragile hope, the past was never far behind. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, a woman with sun-darkened skin and eyes that held a hard kindness. She dismounted slowly, leaning heavily on a carved cane. When Emma saw her, her small face went pale. "Mama," she whispered, voice trembling. The reunion was raw, full of tears and whispered apologies. Mara, Emma's mother, had come back, the same woman who had fought her own battles to find her daughter again. She looked older than her years, worn by grief and hardship, but her spirit was unbroken. Together, we shared stories by the fire, piecing together the fractured past that had brought us all here. Mara told us of the lies that had kept her away, how she had been told Emma was lost, sold, gone forever, how she'd chased rumors and battled shadows to find her again. Emma listened, wide-eyed but quiet, the weight of years settling around her shoulders. That night, as the stars stretched across the dark sky, we made a silent promise to protect what little we had, to fight for a future where fear didn't rule. But fate had other plans. The fire came suddenly, a blaze that roared through the valley, licking the dry grass and devouring the brittle wood. We rushed to save what we could, but the flames were relentless. When the ashes settled, the shack was gone. The orchard was blackened. Our dreams, at least for a moment, seemed lost. But Mara didn't cry. Emma stood tall, her small frame steady against the chaos. "We'll build again," she said quietly. "We have to." The neighbors came. Word spread quickly of the fire, and in the days that followed, hands reached out. Blankets, food, tools, simple things, but they meant everything. Old Joe brought lumber. Mrs. Callahan baked bread. Even the quiet ones who rarely spoke showed up with quiet strength. In those moments, I saw something I hadn't in years of community. Not perfect, not without scars, but real. Emma's laughter began to return, tentative at first, then stronger. She sang softly as she worked in the garden, her voice weaving through the air like fragile threads of hope. Ruth and Mara shared stories and recipes, their bond growing with each passing day. And I found myself sitting by the fire less, standing watch less, and simply being present. But the shadow of the Dawes family loomed still. They hadn't given up, and neither would we. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I found a note pinned to the door. A warning, a promise. They would come again, but this time we wouldn't be alone. The days that followed the note felt heavier than any storm I'd ever faced. It wasn't just the threat hanging in the air, it was the silence between us. The way shadows seemed to stretch longer, waiting for something to break. We rebuilt what the fire had taken, piece by piece. Lumber came from neighbors, nails hammered with steady hands, and the walls rose again like ghosts resurrected from the ashes. But every plank we set felt fragile, like hope held together by threads too thin to bear the weight of what was coming. Emma watched it all with eyes that no longer just feared. The flame inside her had changed, hardened, yes, but also alive. She helped with the work, but when the sun dipped low, she'd disappear into the fields, wandering through the tall grass, as if searching for answers the earth could not give. One afternoon, I found her sitting beneath a lone cottonwood, staring at the horizon. The wind tangled her hair, and for a moment, she seemed like a girl not weighed down by the past, but dreaming of something new. "Do you think they'll come?" she asked, voice barely above the breeze. I didn't answer at first. How do you tell a child that the world often forgets to be kind? Instead, I sat beside her, letting the silence speak what words could not. "We're ready," I said finally. Her gaze didn't waver. Ruth was a pillar for both of us, quiet but unyielding. Her laughter was rare but precious, like a secret gift only the earth could understand. She tended the garden and the house, weaving a fragile peace that held us all steady. She also watched the horizon, as if she could see the storm before it struck. I knew the weight she carried, a history she shared in brief moments, whispered when no one else was listening. We trained every day. I taught Emma to hold the rifle properly, to feel its weight not as a weapon, but as a tool, a promise of protection. She didn't like the idea of hurting anyone, but she understood that sometimes survival demanded it. Her hands, once trembling, now gripped the stock with purpose. I saw in her a resilience I hadn't expected. Evenings were the hardest. The fire burned low, and Mara told stories, old tales of the land, of hardship and hope, of people who refused to be broken. Her voice wove through the room like a warm blanket, chasing away shadows. Emma listened intently, sometimes joining in, her voice soft but sure. But beneath the warmth, fear lingered. The note pinned to the door was more than a threat, it was a countdown. The Dawes family wasn't just coming back. They were coming for war. One morning, the sky was gray and low, and the wind carried a chill that cut through the valley. We heard the first hoofbeats before the riders appeared on the ridge, 3 of them, moving slow but steady. My heart clenched, but I didn't let it show. The first to step into the clearing was Caleb Dawes. His smirk was sharper than ever, his eyes cold and hard. "I see you're still standing," he said, voice dripping with mockery. I met his gaze evenly. "We're not going anywhere." Behind him were 2 others, men I recognized from the market days, men who had once looked the other way when the worst happened. Now, they stood as enforcers of a claim they had no right to make. Ruth moved beside me, steady and silent. Mara gathered Emma close, her eyes fierce. Caleb spat on the ground. "You think a few walls and some neighbors will stop us?" I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped forward. "This isn't just about property," I said. "It's about what's right." The tension was thick enough to choke on. I could feel the weight of every eye in the valley, watching, waiting. Caleb laughed, a harsh sound that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." They camped nearby, their presence a dark cloud over our fragile peace. Nights were restless, filled with whispered plans and the constant watchfulness of those who feared what might come. Emma slept close to Mara, her small hand clutching hers tightly. Ruth and I took turns by the door, rifles ready but not raised. The next few days passed in a tense rhythm, the quiet, before a storm that promised destruction. But we weren't alone. Neighbors who had once been strangers brought tools, food, and prayers. They built walls and hearts alike, standing as silent sentinels in the face of looming darkness. One evening, as the sun bled out over the ridge, Emma came to me with a look I hadn't seen before, determination mingled with fear. "I want to fight," she said quietly. I swallowed hard, the weight of what she was asking settling like a stone in my chest. "You're still a child," I said, my voice rough. She shook her head. "No, I'm not anymore." That night, I taught her to load the rifle with steady hands. She practiced until her fingers bled, until the weight was no longer a burden but a promise. I saw then that she wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for herself. The morning of the confrontation dawned cold and gray. The valley was still, as if holding its breath. The riders approached the gate, their faces set like stone. We stood together, Emma, Mara, Ruth, and me, a fragile line drawn in the dirt. Caleb dismounted slowly, eyes flicking over the small grow. "This ends today," he said. I met his gaze with the quiet fury that had grown in me since the first time I saw that girl tied to a post. "No," I said, "it's just beginning." The battle that followed was brutal, not just with fists and guns, but with wills and hearts. Emma fought like a storm, her courage igniting something in all of us. Mara's voice rang out, calling for peace and strength. Ruth's hands moved with grace, tending wounds and offering quiet strength. When the dust settled, Caleb and his men retreated, but the cost was clear. We were battered, bruised, but unbroken. In the days that followed, the valley healed slowly. Neighbors who had once kept distance now shared meals and stories. Emma laughed again, a sound that felt like sunlight after a long winter. I looked at her then, no longer a scared child, but a warrior forged in fire and love. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't dared hope for: peace. The morning after the skirmish was quiet, almost eerily so. The valley held its breath, as if waiting to see if the fragile peace we had carved out would hold. The Dawes men were gone, retreating into the hills like ghosts, defeated but not broken. But we all knew the fight was far from over. Emma sat by the fire, her hands still trembling slightly as she cleaned her rifle. Her face, smeared with dirt and sweat, was a mask of determination and exhaustion. I sat beside her, trying to find the right words, but all I could offer was silence. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than any speech. "You did well," I finally said. She looked up, eyes fierce but vulnerable. "You're stronger than I ever imagined." She smiled faintly, but there was a shadow in her eyes, the shadow of the things she had seen, the things she'd done. Mara and Ruth were already tending the wounded neighbors who had come to our aid, bloodied but unbowed. The sense of community that had blossomed in the midst of chaos was both a balm and a warning. We were stronger together, but the scars ran deep. As the sun climbed higher, I found myself wandering the edges of the valley, searching for something answers, perhaps, or just a moment of peace. The old cottonwood tree where Emma had sat days before still stood tall, its leaves whispering secrets to the wind. My thoughts drifted back to the past, the memories I had tried to bury, but that now clawed their way to the surface. The life we had lost, the people who had betrayed us, and the family we were desperately trying to protect. It was then that I heard the soft footsteps behind me. Ruth's presence was steady, a grounding force in the swirling storm of my mind. "You can't carry it all alone," she said softly. I nodded, knowing she was right. The past was a weight, but sharing it made it lighter. That evening, we gathered around the fire. The air was thick with unspoken fears and fragile hopes. Mara began telling an old story, one of survival and redemption, of people who faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. Emma listened, her eyes wide and shining with the promise of tomorrow. She was no longer just a child caught in a storm. She was becoming the storm itself. But even as we found strength in each other, the shadows of the past crept closer. Late that night, a stranger arrived at our doorstep, a man with eyes that held 1,000 stories and a warning that chilled my bones. "We're not the only ones watching," he said. "There are others who have their own reasons for wanting you gone." The valley was no longer just a battleground between us and the Dawes family. It was a chessboard, and we were pawns in a much larger game. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and planning. We fortified our homes, trained harder, and forged alliances with those who had once been indifferent. Emma's resolve hardened. She was no longer just fighting for survival. She was fighting for justice, for a future where the past's shadows could no longer reach us. One afternoon, as we stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, Mara spoke words that echoed in my heart. "We carry the scars of yesterday," she said, "but we also carry the seeds of tomorrow." And so we planted those seeds in the soil, in our hearts, and in the fierce hope that one day the valley would know peace. But peace would not come quietly. It would come through fire and blood, through sacrifice and courage. The storm was coming. The valley never sleeps, but those nights were different. They carried a weight, a silent warning that something terrible was closing in like a storm on the horizon. The air smelled of smoke, dust, and the faint iron tang of fear, a scent that clung to my skin, to Emma's clothes, and to every corner of the fragile shelter we'd built. We weren't just defending a place anymore. We were defending what we had become, a family stitched together by broken pasts and fierce hope. The neighbors came more often now, their faces grim but resolute. They brought wood, food, and whatever they could spare. I saw, in their eyes, the same understanding that had settled over me. The world outside might be cruel and unforgiving, but here, in this small patch of dirt and dreams, we could carve out something better. But better was a fragile thing. Late one evening, I sat on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around me like a blanket. Emma came out, silent as a shadow, and sat beside me. Her eyes, usually so guarded, flickered with something new, a glimmer of trust, maybe even hope. "We have to be ready," she said quietly. Her voice was small, but it carried the weight of a promise. I nodded, feeling the old ache in my chest. The man I used to be, the man I thought I'd buried, was waking up. Not the man who had run, but the one who stood and fought. The next days were a blur of preparation. We repaired fences, stocked supplies, and trained. I showed Emma how to handle a rifle properly, not just to shoot, but to respect it. To understand that it was a tool for protection, not vengeance. She learned fast, faster than I expected. Maybe because she had no other choice. Mara worked tirelessly, her hands gentle as she prepared meals and bandaged wounds, but her eyes betrayed the fatigue and fear she kept locked away from us. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge. At first, I thought it was trouble a scout from the Dawes family, or worse, but it was Hank Sutter, one of the few men in the valley whose words still carried weight. He dismounted, dust billowing around his worn boots. His eyes were serious. "I heard talk," he said. "The Dawes aren't finished. They're gathering more men. They think they can take back what they lost." The words settled over us like a death sentence, but there was no time for despair. We called a meeting that night, a gathering of all who would stand with us. The old barn, half collapsed and creaking, was packed with neighbors' farmers, hunters, women and children, all ready to fight for their home. I looked out over the crowd. Faces marked by hardship, hands calloused by labor, eyes burning with determination. Emma stood beside Mara, her small frame firm, her expression unyielding. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," I told the group. "We're fighting for a future, for the right to live without fear." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces softened, some hardened. Plans were made. Watch shifts, patrols, supply runs. We would hold this valley together, or fall trying. The night stretched on with whispered conversations, maps sprawled across tables, and the clinking of bottles filled with moonshine or medicine. Days turned into weeks. The tension was a constant hum, a shadow that moved just beyond the firelight. Emma changed in those weeks. The frightened girl who once flinched at every sound was becoming a leader in her own right. She spoke less, listened more, but when she did speak, people listened. She began teaching the younger children how to find berries without poison, how to track deer without leaving a scent, how to hide when the wind carried danger. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, Mara came to me quietly. "They're coming," she said simply. The Dawes family wasn't just coming back. They were coming for war. We spent that night preparing for the worst. The women gathered knives and pitchforks, the men checked their weapons, and the children were sent to hide. Emma and I stood on the porch, the wind tugging at her braids. "I'm scared," she whispered. I swallowed the lump in my throat and pulled her close. "Me too," I admitted. "But fear doesn't mean you stop fighting. It means you keep going, even when the world says you shouldn't." The next morning broke with a blood-red sky, the sun rising like an omen. The valley held its breath. Then the first riders appeared, dust clouds churning as a group of hardened men approached the settlement. Faces I knew too well. Caleb Dawes led them, his smirk replaced with a grim set to his jaw. No words were exchanged, only the hard clatter of hooves and the tense silence before the storm. The fight was brutal and fast. Shots rang out, screams echoed through the valley, and the earth trembled beneath the fury of men who believed they had the right to claim what wasn't theirs. But we fought like we had never fought before, not for money or pride, but for family, for home. Emma was at my side, her rifle steady, her heart fierce. Mara tended the wounded, her voice calm and strong. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, united by something deeper than fear. When the dust settled, the Dawes lay broken, their plans shattered. But victory came at a cost. Our barn was burned to the ground, our fences torn apart, and scars etched into the land in our souls. That night, we gathered by what remained of the fire pit, the flames licking the sky as if trying to swallow the pain. Emma spoke then, her voice clear and unwavering. "We didn't just survive," she said. "We grew stronger. We are not the broken ones anymore." I looked around at the faces lit by firelight, faces marked by loss, but also by an unbreakable spirit. This was our home, our family, and we would rebuild, no matter what came next. The valley was quiet again, but the storm had passed only to make way for something new, a future. The dawn broke cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the valley like a shroud. The battle had left us bruised but unbroken. Yet beneath the fragile calm, a new tension stirred, a quiet storm gathering strength that none of us dared to name aloud. I watched Emma as she moved through the camp, her eyes sharper, more determined. The girl who had once trembled at shadows was now a force, the unyielding heart of our fragile family. But with strength came sacrifice. We all wore etched into our faces, our bodies, the silent spaces between words. Mara's hands trembled less now, but her smile was rarer, weighed down by the things she'd seen in the lives she couldn't save. I saw it in her eyes when she thought no one was watching the quiet grief that threatened to drown her. That morning, as the mist curled over the hills, Hank returned, riding hard and fast, his face set like stone. The news he brought was worse than any of us had feared. "They're coming back," he said, voice low and grim, "with more men, more fire. They want to burn it all down." The camp erupted into chaos, but amid the shouting and hurried preparations, I found Emma standing still, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Let them come," she said, voice steady as steel. "We'll be ready." We fortified every weak point. Fences were rebuilt with sharpened stakes. Lookouts took their posts high in the trees, eyes scanning the shadows for the first sign of movement. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were defending our right to exist, to carve out a future from the harshness of the world. Night fell like a blanket, thick and suffocating. The wind whispered warnings through the dry grass, and the scent of smoke lingered, a cruel reminder of what was to come. I sat beside the dying embers of a fire, Emma leaning against me, her breath warm against my skin. "No matter what happens," she murmured, "we face it together." The hours passed in a tense silence broken only by distant howls, or something worse. When the first torches appeared, flickering like ghosts in the darkness, a cold rage ignited inside me. These men weren't just enemies, they were the embodiment of every nightmare we'd fought to escape. The battle that followed was a maelstrom of noise and fury. Gunshots cracked through the night, voices screamed, and the clash of steel rang sharp and merciless. Amid the chaos, I saw Emma move like a shadow, quick, fierce, unstoppable. She fought not just with weapons, but with the fire in her eyes, a storm that no enemy could quell. But war is never clean. The ground was soaked with more than rain by dawn, and the cost weighed heavily on us all. Friends we'd made, bonds we'd forged, were broken in an instant. Mara's cry when she found one of the children fallen cut deeper than any blade. I held her as she wept, my own heart breaking in silence. Yet, even as the valley mourned, something stronger took root, a fierce, unbreakable promise that we would not be undone. Emma stood before the gathered survivors, her voice rising above the pain and loss. "We've lost much," she said, eyes blazing. "But we are not finished. This land, this family will stand as long as we stand with it." The valley held its breath, and then, slowly, the first light of hope broke through the storm. The days that followed the battle were the quietest I had known in a long Timinot, because peace had settled, but because the storm inside each of us had yet to find a way out. We were battered, bruised, and broken in places we couldn't show, but we stood together, shoulder to shoulder, forging something stronger than any of the flames that had tried to consume us. Emma was no longer the scared girl tied to a post behind a saloon, nor just a survivor of a brutal sale. She had become a beacon not because she sought the light, but because her soul burned so fiercely that darkness could not touch her anymore. I saw it in her eyes every morning, the quiet refusal to be a victim, the steel-wrapped tenderness that could soothe and fight all at once. Her mother Mara had found a fragile kind of peace too, though the ghosts of her past followed her like shadows. I watched her every time she looked out over the barren fields, hands clasped tightly, whispering promises to a life they once dreamed of. I didn't ask what she said. I didn't need to. Some wounds speak in silence. We rebuilt the cabin slowly, each plank laid with care, every nail hammered down with purpose. It was more than shelter. It was a testament, a monument to the fact that even when the world burns you down, you can still rise a stronger, wiser, and unbroken. The neighbors pitched in, quietly but surely. There was no grand speech, no celebrations, just hands working and eyes meeting with unspoken understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long orange shadows across the fields, Emma and I sat by the fire. The warmth from the flames didn't chase away the chill in the air, but it was enough. She handed me a worn piece of paper, a scrap she'd been keeping close. It was a letter, fragile and folded, written in shaky handwriting but filled with hope. "It's from the lawyer," she said softly. "The papers came through. They say I'm free, now no one can claim me." I looked at her, the weight of what she'd endured settling deep in my chest. "You're yours," I said. "No debts, no chains." She smiled then, a real smile and not the cautious one I'd seen when she first arrived, but a light that reached her eyes and stayed there. "It feels like the first time I can breathe." That night, under a sky thick with stars, I realized that salvation isn't just about rescue. It's about the moments after the rebuilding, the healing, the learning to trust again. It's about finding strength in those who stand beside you, even when the world wants to tear you apart. In the weeks that followed, life slowly found its rhythm. Emma tended the chickens. Mara cooked with quiet pride, and I kept watch over the fields. Our silence was no longer heavy. It was filled with the promise of a future none of us dared imagine before. One morning, as the frost melted away and the first wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth, Emma stood at the edge of the property, looking out toward the horizon. I joined her, the cool breeze stirring the hair around her face. "Do you think we're really free?" she asked. I put an arm around her shoulder. "Freedom isn't about never being scared. It's about standing your ground when fear comes knocking." She leaned into me. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I shook my head. "You saved me too. Maybe that's what it's always been." We stood there for a long moment, watching the sun rise higher, spilling gold across the land. The fire had taken so much, but it couldn't take everything, not the hope, not the love, not the fight that burned in us. Because sometimes the greatest rescue is not from chains or cages, but from the shadows within ourselves. And this was our beginning. The cold wind whispered through the bare cottonwoods as dawn cracked the sky open like a fragile egg. For years, that wind had carried stories of loss and silence, of a broken girl, a weary man, and a ragged hope stitched together by nothing more than stubborn will. But on this morning, it carried something different. I watched Emma step onto the porch, no longer the shadow of a frightened child, but a young woman forged in fire and tempered by pain. Her eyes met mine, steady and unflinching, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of her past alone. We were a family not by blood, but by choice, by battle, and by the scars that ran deep. The town below was waking, the market stirring with the clatter of hooves and the murmur of voices. The same market where I'd found her tied to that post, where her life was once auctioned like cattle. The same market where fear had once held her silent and small. Today, she would walk through it on her own terms. I handed her a worn coat, its edges frayed but warm. "Ready?" I asked, though I already knew. She nodded, a quiet strength in her jaw. "I'm ready." We walked down the dusty road together, footsteps steady on the cracked earth. The townsfolk stopped and stared, some with curiosity, some with unease, but none dared speak the words that hung heavy in the air. When Emma reached the center of the square, she paused. The faces blurred around her, but she stood tall, no longer a girl to be sold or hidden, but a woman reclaiming her story piece by piece. I stayed back, watching, feeling the tight coil of protectiveness and pride unwind in my chest. A man stepped forward, a relic from the past, his eyes cold and hard, but his posture hesitant. He opened his mouth to speak, but Emma raised a hand, and silence fell. "No more debts. No more chains. This is my life," she said, voice clear and unyielding, carrying across the square like a bell tolling for freedom. The crowd murmured, some shifting uncomfortably, but others nodded, as if acknowledging a truth they'd long ignored. I saw a flicker of something in the man's eyes, regret maybe, or the bitter taste of defeat. He took a step back, then another, and disappeared into the dust and the past. Emma turned, her gaze locking with mine, a spark of fierce fire burning bright. "Thank you," she said softly, "for showing me that even the broken can be whole again." I smiled, the weight of years lifting with that simple truth. We saved each other, I told her, and now we get to live. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the town and the fields beyond in golden light, I knew this was more than an ending. It was the first chapter of everything we'd fight to build. Because healing isn't about forgetting the fire, it's about learning to dance in the ashes. And together, we would dance. The road ahead was long, and the shadows would always come calling. But for the first time in a long time, we were ready. Not just to survive, but to live. If you were in the main character's shoes, would you have fought the same battle? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video. While you're here, explore the other videos on your screen. There are more stories waiting for you.